You have rebuilt. More than once. You have taken what fell apart and put it back together with your own hands. With what faith you had left. With the courage of someone who refused to stay down. And it has fallen again, not because you did something wrong, because God is building something that your hands alone were never meant to complete. This message tells you what He is building instead. There is a pattern in your life that your enemies have watched and misread completely. A pattern of building and collapse, of constructing something with real faith and real effort and real investment, and then watching it come apart. Not once, more than once, in different areas of your life, with different materials, at different moments, but with a consistency that has begun to feel like more than coincidence, like a signature, like something deliberate, something that keeps happening for a reason you have not yet been able to fully name. And your enemies, those who have observed this pattern from the outside, have drawn the obvious conclusion that there is something wrong with you, that the repeated collapses are evidence of a fundamental deficiency in your judgment, in your faith, in your capacity to build something that lasts, that the pattern proves something about your relationship with God, or about your readiness for what you have been believing for. And those conclusions, even when not spoken directly to you, have added their own weight to the weight of the collapses themselves. They were wrong, every single time. They were reading the surface of a process whose most important dimension was entirely invisible to their observation. Because the collapses were never evidence of your deficiency, they were evidence of God's precision, His refusal to let you settle into something smaller than what He had prepared. His insistence on keeping your hands open enough to receive what He was building, rather than closed around what you had built yourself. Every collapse was an act of divine love, dressed in the clothing of loss, pointing towards something that your own construction could never have produced. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further into this message. There is a fundamental difference between a God who prevents you from building and a God who waits for you to build and then dismantles what you built. The first would be a God who blocks your progress. The second is a God who redirects it, who allows the building because the building is part of the process. Because what you learn in the building and what you discover in the collapse and what you become in the rebuilding are all necessary components of the preparation for what He has been building on your behalf in the invisible. The collapses were never setbacks, they were strategic redirections. And every one of them was moving you closer to something your own construction could never have reached. Chosen. I am speaking directly to you who are watching this video at this exact moment in your life, to you who know the specific weight of someone who has rebuilt more than once, who has taken the materials of what collapsed and found the courage to begin again. To you who have carried the silent question of why this pattern keeps repeating. This message exists to answer that question, with a directness and a precision that I hope reaches the deepest place where the question has lived without a satisfying answer. Let me describe with precision what it costs to live inside this pattern of building and collapse. Not from a safe theological distance, from the real interior of what it feels like to rebuild and see it fall again. The first thing this pattern does is create a complicated relationship with the act of beginning, because beginning costs something. Every time you start to build something, a relationship, a project, a ministry, a version of your life that corresponds to what you believe you were created for, you invest. Not just time and effort, but hope, desire, the specific vulnerability of someone who has allowed themselves to want something and to act on that wanting. And when what you built collapses, it is not only the thing itself that falls. The investment falls with it, the hope falls, the desire falls, the specific vulnerability you extended in the building falls, and the next time you are standing at the beginning of something new, some part of you carries the accumulated memory of every previous beginning that did not end the way you hoped, and that memory, that weight of previous collapses, changes the quality of the beginning, makes it more careful, more protected, more calculated than the full openness of someone who has never had a beginning turn into a collapse. There is also something this pattern does to your relationship with your own judgment. Because when something you built collapses, the natural question is, what did I do wrong? What could I have seen that I did not see? What decision did I make that a wiser person would not have made? And these questions are not entirely wrong. Sometimes a collapse does reveal something about the quality of the building, something about the materials used, or the foundation laid, or the direction chosen. But when the collapses happen repeatedly, across different areas, in situations where the judgment was genuinely good, and the faith was genuinely real, and the effort was genuinely total, the question of what I did wrong begins to produce answers that go too deep, that do not stop at the specific decision that led to the collapse, but reach into the person who made the decision, and conclude that the problem is not what you built, but who is doing the building. You have the right to feel the cost of this pattern. The specific exhaustion of someone who has rebuilt more than once is a real exhaustion, not a weakness, not the sign of insufficient faith or inadequate resilience or a deficiency in the relationship with God. It is the honest experience of someone who has been asked to let go of what they built more than once, at real cost, and who has found the courage to begin again, more than once, in the face of everything that the previous collapses had deposited in their interior. That courage, that willingness to begin again when everything in you knows what beginning has cost before, is one of the rarest and most precious things that exists, and it deserves to be named and honored before it is given a spiritual interpretation. There is also something this pattern produces in your relationship with other people that I want to name honestly, because the person who has lived through repeated collapses of what they have built tends to develop over time a very particular approach to sharing what they are building. They become careful about who they tell, selective about what they reveal, protective of the new building in ways they were not protective of the early ones. Not because they have become secretive or dishonest, but because they have learned through experience that sharing the building before it is established invites a particular kind of response from the people around them that the collapse then makes painful in an additional way. The responses of excitement and investment and hope from the people they told, which then have to be managed and explained and processed alongside their own grief when the collapse comes. And so they carry the building more quietly, more privately, more carefully guarded. And that guardedness, though it protects them from something real, also adds its own layer of loneliness to the process. And then there is the dimension of this wound that goes deepest, the one that touches your capacity to hope without protecting yourself from the hope itself. Because hope that has been extended into a building that then collapsed more than once begins to develop a self-protective quality. A careful distance between the full intensity of what you desire and the full investment of hoping for it. As if something in you has learned to hold what it is building at a slight remove, to not go all the way in, to maintain a small reserve of unexpended hope as protection against the full impact of another collapse. And this protective distance, this inability to hope with the same total and unguarded openness that characterized the first building, is perhaps the most significant long-term cost that the pattern of repeated collapse can produce. Here is the truth that God wants to place in the deepest layer of your understanding today. God does not break what you build because He is against you. He breaks what you build because He is so completely for you that He refuses to let you settle into something that would prevent you from arriving at what He has already prepared. Look at Abraham. And I want you to look at his life not as a series of spectacular moments of faith, but as the precise map of a man who was asked repeatedly to let go of what he had built his life around. He built his life in Ur of the Chaldeans. God asked him to leave. He built his understanding of how the promise would be fulfilled around Ishmael. God told him that was not the path. He built his entire life around Isaac. God asked him to place Isaac on the altar. And in Genesis 22 verse 12, the angel says to Abraham, "Do not lay your hand on the boy, or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Every time Abraham was willing to release what he had built, God was able to do something that Abraham's own construction had made impossible. The repeated letting go was not the story of a man who could not hold on to things. It was the story of a man whose open hands became the instrument through which God did his most significant work. Here is the first truth I want to anchor in your understanding. God does not dismantle what you build to leave you with nothing. He dismantles what you build to build something through you that your own construction was preventing. Your hands closed around what you built cannot receive what he has prepared. Your energy invested in maintaining what you constructed cannot be invested in what he is constructing. And sometimes, often, the only way to open what is closed and redirect what is invested is to allow what was built to come apart. Not as punishment, as preparation, as the precise and intentional act of a God who loves you too much to leave you settled in something smaller than what he has already completed on your behalf. In Jeremiah 29 verse 11, God says to people who have lost what they built, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." Plans, not improvisation. Not a God who is reacting to your collapses and trying to make the best of a situation that surprised him. A God who knew, who planned, who designed every collapse as part of a plan that was already complete before the first building began. The collapses were always inside the plan, not as failures of the plan, as components of it. Each one moving you closer to something that the unbroken buildings would have kept you from reaching. Here is the second truth. What your enemies celebrated as your defeat every time something collapsed was actually your promotion. Not a promotion that looked like one from the outside, but a promotion nonetheless. A movement towards something larger, something more precisely fitted to who you are and what you were created for. Something that the thing that collapsed could not have taken you to. Because every collapse removed something that was occupying the space that what God had prepared required. And the enemies who celebrated the collapse were celebrating the very act of God that was removing the last obstacle between you and what they would not have wanted you to reach. Proverbs 19 verse 21 says, with a directness that should reframe every collapse you have ever lived through. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. Many plans, not no plans. Your plans were real. Your buildings were genuine expressions of real faith and real vision and real effort, but they were your plans. And what the Lord has purposed, what he decided before you were born about what your life would build and what it would produce and what it would leave behind, that is what stands. Not instead of your plans, but in place of the plans that would have taken you in a different direction. The collapse was always the purpose overriding the plan. And the purpose is always larger. Here is the third truth. The things God breaks in your life, he always replaces with something he builds himself. Not immediately, not always visibly in the moment of the collapse, but consistently and precisely, and with a timing that takes into account not only what needs to be replaced, but what you need to become in the period between the collapse and the replacement in order to be able to receive and carry what he is bringing. The pattern is not collapse without replacement. It is collapse followed by divine construction that exceeds what collapsed by the exact measure that his building always exceeds yours. Chosen, my question for you today is this. If you could look back at every collapse you have lived through and see it not as a failure, but as God removing something that was standing between you and what he had prepared, which collapse would you be most grateful for? Let that question find the places in you where the pattern of building and collapse has been most painful, because those are the places where what God has been building in replacement is most significant. Let me show you with precision what someone looks like who has genuinely understood why God keeps breaking what they keep building, who has stopped reading the collapses as evidence against them and has begun to receive them as the most direct form of divine redirection available in a life that is genuinely called. The first transformation is in their relationship with the act of building itself. Before this understanding, building is a high-stakes act. Every new construction carries the full weight of every previous collapse. the fear of another fall, the protection against hope that goes too deep, the calculation of risk that characterizes someone who has been hurt by the collapse of what they invested in before. And this protective approach to building, though understandable, produces buildings of a different quality than the ones built by someone who goes all the way in. Buildings that are hedged, carefully managed, held at the slight distance that the fear of collapse has imposed. After this understanding, the relationship with building changes at its foundation. The building is no longer a high-stakes bet on an uncertain outcome. It is a step in a process whose ultimate direction is in the hands of someone who does not make mistakes in what he dismantles and what he allows to stand. And this shift produces a freedom in the building that the protective approach could not produce. A willingness to go all the way in, to invest fully, to build with genuine openness, not because the person has become naive about the possibility of collapse, but because they have understood that if this building collapses, it will be because God is redirecting them towards something that this building was preventing. And that redirection, however painful in the moment of the collapse, is always in their favor. The second transformation is in the speed and the quality of their recovery from collapses. Before this understanding, recovery from a collapse is a long and costly process, not just because the thing that collapsed needs to be grieved, but because the collapse carries all the weight of every previous collapse, and the accumulated weight of multiple collapses produces a recovery that is slower and more difficult and more resistant than the recovery from a single isolated loss. The person carries not just this collapse, but all the ones that came before it. And sorting through all of that takes time and costs energy that leaves them with less for what comes next. After this understanding, recovery changes in a way that is almost counterintuitive. The person still grieves the collapse, genuinely and honestly, without minimizing what was lost, or performing a spiritual response that bypasses the real cost. But the grief does not carry the accumulated weight of every previous collapse in the same way, because each collapse is now understood in its context, as a specific act of divine redirection rather than as another data point in a pattern of personal failure, and understanding it in its context, releasing it from the burden of proving something about the person's deficiency, frees the grief to be what it needs to be without also becoming a verdict on the person's future. The third transformation is in their capacity to recognize what God is building in replacement before the replacement is fully visible. Because someone who has lived through enough collapses and understood them correctly begins to develop a particular sensitivity to the shape of what God builds, how his constructions feel compared to their own, what the early signs look like that something new is beginning to take form in the invisible. And this sensitivity, this developed capacity to perceive what God is doing before it becomes fully visible, allows them to participate in his building rather than continuing to invest in their own. The fourth transformation, the deepest and most lasting, is in the way they accompany others who are living through their own collapses. Because someone who has understood the divine pattern behind repeated collapse and who has seen what God builds in replacement possesses a presence in the moments of other people's losses that no one else can offer. Not the theoretical comfort of someone who has a theological framework for why God allows collapses, but the incarnate and authority-carrying presence of someone who has been in the collapse, who knows what it costs, who has stood in the rubble of something they had genuinely invested in, and who can say to someone else standing in their own rubble, with the full authority of personal experience, "This is not your end. This is your redirection, and what God builds in replacement is always larger than what just fell, chosen." I want to finish with this. Every collapse you have lived through was a redirection. Every building that came apart was making room for something that God had already completed on your behalf in the invisible. Every time your hands were forced open by the loss of what they were holding, those open hands became capable of receiving something that the closed hands could never have held. Not because the loss was not real. It was. Not because the cost was not genuine. It was. But because the God who allowed the collapse is the same God who had already prepared what was coming next. And what he prepared always exceeds what collapsed by the measure that his building always exceeds yours. Your enemies celebrated every collapse. They saw the rubble and concluded that you were finished. That the pattern proved something about your capacity, about your relationship with God, about the validity of what you had been believing for. They were wrong. They were looking at the demolition site of something God was clearing to build something larger. And the celebration they offered at the site of your rubble was premature by the exact distance between what fell and what is coming to replace it. Stop trying to rebuild what God has broken. Not because the building instinct in you is wrong, but because what He has prepared for you to build next is larger than what you were holding. And the next building, the one you will begin from this place of open hands and redirected energy and the hard-won understanding of someone who has learned what God's dismantling produces, will be the most significant thing you have ever built. Not because you are finally good enough to build something that lasts, but because this time you will be building with God rather than for Him. And what is built with God stands. What breaks you open is what lets the light in.